On the morning of April 18, 1942, the city of Tokyo held an air raid drill. It was a Saturday. Air raid wardens gazed up at a cloudless sky. Fire brigades wheeled their equipment through the streets. Barrage balloons floated above the waterfront. Nobody took it seriously. The drill bore no realism at all. No sirens sounded. No bombs fell. By noon it was over, and the all-clear was given. The residents of Tokyo went back to eating lunch, walking their children, running their shops. The war was 5 months old, and Japan was winning it. The Imperial Japanese Navy controlled the largest ocean on Earth, and the home islands sat behind a wall of water and warships that no enemy had breached in the entire recorded history of Japan. For 5 months, Japan had known nothing but victory. In December of 1941, the Imperial Navy had crippled the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 battleships in a single morning. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces had captured Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and most of the Philippines. Singapore, the great British fortress of the Far East, had surrendered in February. The Dutch East Indies had fallen in March. The British were retreating through Burma. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, a quarter of the world's population had come under Japanese control in less than half a year. The Japanese people had been told by their government and their military that the home islands were untouchable. No enemy had ever bombed Japan. No enemy would ever bomb Japan. The Pacific Ocean was a moat, and the combined fleet was the wall behind it. This was not propaganda. It was something closer to a national article of faith. Then, just after noon, residents across several Tokyo wards looked up and saw large, twin-engine aircraft flying lower than any Japanese plane they had ever seen. The aircraft had white stars on their wings. Civilians waved at them. Children pointed and cheered. People on the ground assumed these were Japanese military aircraft, perhaps part of the drill that had just ended, perhaps rehearsing for the Emperor's birthday celebration later that month. They were not Japanese aircraft. They were North American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers of the United States Army Air Forces. They were flying at roughly 1,200 feet, and they were carrying 500-pound bombs. Within seconds, those bombs were falling on Tokyo. In the next 30 minutes, 15 more American bombers struck targets across the Japanese capital, as well as Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. They hit oil storage facilities, steel mills, power plants, and factory buildings. Japanese anti-aircraft guns fired wildly. Fighters scrambled from airfields across the region. But the bombers came in so low and so fast that by the time the defenses responded, the aircraft were already gone, vanishing to the southwest over the Pacific. When the smoke cleared, the physical damage was minor. Roughly 112 buildings destroyed, 53 more damaged. But inside the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, the damage was something else entirely. It was psychological, and it was devastating. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, reportedly wrote in his diary that night that the victory belonged to the enemy. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, subscribe, because this channel tells the stories that textbooks leave out. Ugaki was not the only Japanese officer stunned by what had happened. Across the Japanese military establishment, from the Navy Ministry in Tokyo to the Combined Fleet headquarters aboard the battleship Yamato, one question consumed every strategist, every intelligence officer, and every admiral. Where did those bombers come from? The question was not rhetorical. It was, by every calculation the Japanese could make, unanswerable. No American land base existed within striking range of Japan. The closest American-held territory in the Pacific was Midway Atoll, over 2,300 miles from Tokyo. The Hawaiian Islands were nearly 4,000 miles away. A B-25 Mitchell had a maximum range of roughly 1,300 miles in combat configuration. The math did not work. The bombers could not have come from any land base. That left the only other possibility, an aircraft carrier. But that possibility was, in the judgment of every naval aviation expert in Japan, equally impossible. Aircraft carriers launched small, single-engine planes, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo aircraft, purpose-built machines with folding wings and low landing speeds designed to catch arresting wires on a short deck. The B-25 Mitchell was a medium bomber. It had a wingspan of 67 feet and 7 inches. It weighed nearly 20,000 pounds empty and over 35,000 pounds fully loaded. On land, it needed well over 1,000 feet of runway to take off. A carrier deck offered less than 500. No bomber that size had ever been launched from a ship in combat. The idea was absurd. And yet the bombs had fallen on Tokyo. The white stars had been seen on the wings. The aircraft had been real. Something that could not happen had happened, and the men who ran the most powerful navy in the Pacific could not explain how. But before we can understand what flew over Tokyo that afternoon, we need to go back 5 months, to a January morning in Norfolk, Virginia, where a submarine officer looked out a window and saw something that no one else in the United States Navy had noticed. On January 10, 1942, Captain Francis S. Lowe was at Naval Air Station Norfolk, inspecting the Navy's newest aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. Lowe was not an aviator. He was a submariner serving on the staff of Admiral Ernest J. King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. He had no particular reason to think about bombers. But as he looked out across the airfield, he noticed something. Army twin-engine bombers were making practice runs over the outline of a carrier flight deck that had been painted on one of the runways. The painted outline was used to train Navy pilots in carrier approaches. The Army bombers were not supposed to be practicing on it. They were simply using the airfield for their own drills, and the painted deck happened to be there. Lowe watched those bombers take off and land in the space marked on the tarmac, and a thought struck him that would change the course of the Pacific War. If those bombers could operate in a space that size on land, could they take off from an actual carrier at sea? He brought the idea to Admiral King. King was skeptical but intrigued. He assigned his air operations officer, Captain Donald Duncan, to study the feasibility. Duncan spent several days analyzing the numbers. Which bombers might fit on a carrier deck? Which ones had the range to reach Japan? Which ones could take off in under 500 feet? His conclusion was that one aircraft, the B-25 Mitchell, met every requirement. Its wingspan was narrow enough to clear the carrier's island superstructure. Its range, with modifications, could reach Japan from the mid-Pacific, and critically, its takeoff distance could be shortened to something that might, just might, work on a carrier deck. But there was a problem that made the entire concept seem like madness. The B-25 could take off from a carrier. It could never land on one. The bomber was too heavy, too fast, and too large to catch an arresting wire. Any pilot who tried to land a B-25 on a carrier deck would kill himself and probably destroy the ship. This meant that any mission using carrier-launched bombers would be a one-way trip for the aircraft. Every plane that took off would be lost, every single one. Before anyone would approve the idea, someone had to prove that a B-25 could actually leave a carrier deck. On February 3, 1942, 2 B-25s were loaded by crane onto the deck of the Hornet at Norfolk. The carrier steamed out past the Virginia Capes and turned into the wind. Lieutenant John E. Fitzgerald, a B-25 test pilot, climbed into the cockpit of the first bomber. Before he even released his brakes, his airspeed indicator was already showing roughly 45 miles per hour, generated entirely by the carrier's speed and the headwind across the deck. He had approximately 500 feet of deck ahead of him. He released the brakes, rolled forward, and lifted off without incident. 20 minutes later, Lieutenant James F. McCarthy launched the second bomber, using only 275 feet of deck. Both pilots flew back to Norfolk. Neither one knew why he had just risked his life. The test was classified. But it had worked. The concept was proven. The mission was approved immediately as Special Aviation Project No. 1, a joint Army and Navy operation, the first of its kind. Now they needed someone to plan it and lead it. In any conventional military analysis, a plan that guarantees the destruction of every aircraft involved is not a plan. It is a waste. But this was January of 1942. Pearl Harbor was 6 weeks old. The United States had suffered nothing but defeats. The Philippines were falling. Wake Island had been captured. American morale was shattered. And President Franklin Roosevelt was pressing his generals and admirals for one thing above all else. He wanted to hit Japan. He wanted to hit it fast, and he did not much care how it was done. The man chosen to figure out how was not a staff officer, not a planner, not a man who spent his career behind a desk. He was a 45-year-old lieutenant colonel named James Harold Doolittle, and he was, by almost any measure, the most remarkable aviator alive. Jimmy Doolittle was born on December 14, 1896, in Alameda, California, and spent part of his childhood in the gold rush town of Nome, Alaska, where he learned to box and drive a dog sled. He was small, 5 feet 4 inches, but he fought in the bantamweight division as an amateur and never backed down from anything in his life. He enlisted as a flying cadet during the First World War, earned his wings, and then did something that separated him from every other pilot of his generation. He went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering. It was among the first such degrees ever awarded in the United States. Doolittle was not simply a brave pilot, he was a scientist who flew. On September 24, 1929, he became the first person in history to take off, fly a course, and land an aircraft using only instruments, without any visual reference to the ground or the horizon. That single flight, performed in a hooded cockpit at Mitchell Field, New York, is regarded as one of the most important achievements in the history of aviation. He won the Schneider Trophy in 1925, the Bendix Trophy in 1931, and the Thompson Trophy in 1932. He set a world landplane speed record of 296 miles per hour. He performed the first outside loop, a maneuver that other pilots believed was fatal. Working as an aviation executive for Shell Oil in the 1930s, he championed the development of 100-octane aviation fuel, the fuel that would power every high-performance Allied fighter and bomber of the war. This was the man the Army Air Forces chose to plan the most dangerous air mission of the war, General Henry H. Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, selected Doolittle because he combined something almost no one else possessed, the precision of an engineer with the nerve of a racing pilot. Doolittle accepted the assignment. Then he did what everyone who knew him expected. He insisted on leading the mission himself. The plan Doolittle developed was elegant in its ruthlessness. 16B. 25 bombers would be loaded onto the deck of the carrier, USS Hornet. The Hornet would sail across the Pacific under escort and approach to within roughly 400 nautical miles of Japan. The bombers would launch from the carrier deck, fly to Japan, bomb their targets, and then continue west across the East China Sea to airfields in unoccupied China. They would never return to the carrier. They could not. The planes were expendable. The mission was not. To make it work, the aircraft had to be stripped and rebuilt. At depots in Minneapolis and Sacramento, mechanics tore the B-25s apart and put them back together as something the factory had never imagined. The lower gun turret was removed to save weight. Additional fuel tanks were installed everywhere space could be found, in the bomb bay, in the crawlway, in the space where the turret had been, even collapsible rubber bladders strapped above the bomb bay floor. Total fuel capacity rose from roughly 646 gallons to over 1,100 gallons. The heavy liaison radio was pulled out, enforcing total radio silence. The classified Norden bomb sight, one of the most closely guarded instruments in the American arsenal, he was removed because it was worthless. At the low altitude the bombers would fly, and too sensitive to risk falling into enemy hands. In its place, Captain Charles Ross Greening designed a simple aiming device from 2 pieces of aluminum that cost about 20 cents and worked perfectly. The men called it the Mark Twain. And in the tail cone of each aircraft, where the rear guns would normally sit, the crews installed 2 broomsticks painted black. They looked exactly like machine gun barrels from a distance. They were meant to fool Japanese fighter pilots into thinking the bombers had tail guns. They worked. Each aircraft carried 4 500-pound bombs, 3 high-explosive, and 1 incendiary cluster, and wired to several of those bombs were Japanese friendship medals, decorations that the Japanese government had awarded to American servicemen before the war. The Hornet's air intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jurica Jr., who had served in Tokyo before the war, donated his own medal. It was going back to Japan. But all the engineering in the world meant nothing if the pilots could not get those bombers off the deck. And that was where the mission came closest to being abandoned before it ever started. The crews were drawn from the 17th Bombardment Group, the most experienced B-25 unit in the Army Air Forces. In late February, Doolittle asked for volunteers for an unspecified, extremely hazardous mission. Almost everyone in the group stepped forward. 24 crews were selected, the best pilots, the steadiest navigators, the sharpest bombardiers. They were sent to Eglin Field in Florida, and for 3 weeks in March of 1942, They trained for something none of them had ever done. The Navy assigned Lieutenant Henry L. Miller from the Naval Air Station at Pensacola to teach Army pilots a skill that Army pilots were never supposed to need: how to take off from a carrier. White lines were painted on the runway to simulate the dimensions of a carrier deck. Miller drilled the pilots in the technique: hold the brakes, run the engines to full power, drop full flaps. Release the brakes and haul the nose up to near stall attitude, pulling the bomber into the air in the shortest possible distance. At first, the Army pilots were skeptical. Several believed it was physically impossible to get a fully loaded B-25 airborne in less than 500 feet. Miller showed them it was not. By the time training ended, the pilots could get a fully loaded B-25 airborne in 350 feet with a 46-mile-per-hour headwind. They also trained in low-altitude flying, skimming treetops across the Florida Panhandle. They practiced over-water navigation across the Gulf of Mexico, flying without visual landmarks or radio guidance, the way they would have to fly over the Pacific. They drilled on low-altitude bombing, since the Norden bomb site had been removed, and their improvised 20-cent site required a steady run at 1,500 feet. Gunners trained with their weapons, though there was not enough time for proper air-to-air gunnery exercises with towed targets. Every hour of those 3 weeks was accounted for. There was no margin and no room for error. Doolittle, 45 years old and outranking every man in the group, qualified alongside his pilots. He had set himself a rule: if he could not pass the short takeoff test, he would fly the mission as a co-pilot instead of leading it. He passed. The men did not know their target until they were at sea. They knew only that the mission was dangerous and that it involved an aircraft carrier. Most of them had never seen a carrier. Some of them had never seen the ocean. They were, in almost every measurable way, ordinary young Americans. They came from 35 different states. The youngest was Sergeant David W. Pohl, who was 20 years old. The oldest, apart from Doolittle, was Sergeant Waldo J. Byther, who was 35. Among them were men who had been students, factory workers, clerks, and farmhands before the war found them. Lieutenant Ted Lawson had studied aeronautical engineering and worked at the Douglas Aircraft Factory before enlisting. Corporal Jacob DeShazer had been a farm boy from Oregon. Sergeant Harold A. Spatz, whom everyone called Skinny, was 20 years old and came from the small town of Lebo, Kansas. Lieutenant William G. Farrow was from Darlington, South Carolina. These were not elite warriors drawn from a military aristocracy. They were the sons of mechanics and shopkeepers and schoolteachers, and in less than 3 weeks they would fly 16 bombers off the deck of an aircraft carrier into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. On April 1, 1942, 16 B-25s were loaded onto the flight deck of the USS Hornet at the Alameda Naval Air Station in San Francisco Bay. The carrier's own fighters were struck below to the hangar deck, leaving the Hornet entirely dependent on other ships for air defense. The bombers were lashed down in launch order from stern to bow, their wings hanging over the edges of the deck. On April 2, the Hornet sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge, with the bombers in plain view. Civilians on the bridge could see the aircraft lashed to the deck. Dock workers at Alameda had watched them being loaded. The secrecy that had shielded the mission during training was now impossible to maintain on the open water, but the Japanese did not know, and that was what mattered. Once at sea, Captain Mark Mitcher, the Hornet's commanding officer, announced the mission over the ship's loudspeaker. He told his crew that their ship would carry the Army bombers to the coast of Japan for the bombing of Tokyo. The crew erupted in cheers. Several sailors slapped each other on the back. Others stood in stunned silence. They were sailing directly toward the most powerful navy on Earth, with a flight deck so packed with Army bombers that they could not launch a single one of their own fighters. During the crossing, the raiders received their first detailed intelligence briefing on their targets. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jurica Jr., the Hornet's air intelligence officer, had served as an assistant naval attaché in Tokyo before the war. He had walked the streets of the Japanese capital, studied its industry, and secretly prepared bombing maps of Japanese military and industrial installations. Jurica stood before the assembled crews in the Hornet's wardroom and gave them a city-by-city breakdown of what they would hit. He showed them photographs and maps. He identified oil storage areas, factory complexes, and shipbuilding yards. And then he pulled out a small bronze medal, a Japanese friendship decoration that the imperial government had awarded him before the war. He handed it to Doolittle, who had it wired to one of the bombs. It was going back to Japan the hard way. 11 days later, on April 13, the Hornets group rendezvoused in the mid-Pacific, with a second task force built around the carrier USS Enterprise, commanded by Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. Combined, Task Force 16 comprised 2 carriers, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 fleet oilers, with over 10,000 sailors. Enterprise's aircraft would provide the task force's air cover, since the Hornet's flight deck was completely blocked by the bombers. To his crew aboard Enterprise, Halsey made a simple announcement. He told them they were bound for Tokyo. The plan called for the bombers to launch at dusk, roughly 400 miles from Japan, bomb their targets at night, and reach Chinese airfields by morning. The Chinese were supposed to be alerted to prepare landing fields, fuel, and homing beacons, but secrecy was so tight that the notification was never properly sent. The Chinese airfields would not be ready. It would not matter, because the plan was about to be shattered. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 18, with the task force still roughly 650 nautical miles from Japan, Enterprise's radar detected Japanese vessels ahead. They were picket boats, small patrol craft that Admiral Yamamoto had stationed in a line hundreds of miles offshore as an early warning screen against exactly this kind of attack. Yamamoto had imagined that the threat would come from carrier-based naval aircraft, which had a combat radius of roughly 300 miles. His picket line was placed well beyond that range. If an American carrier tried to close the distance, the picket boats would spot it, radio Tokyo, and give the Japanese Navy time to scramble its defenses. The strategy was sound. What Yamamoto had not imagined was that the attack would come from bombers that did not need to be within 300 miles. His picket line was in exactly the wrong place. At 7:38 that morning, a small Japanese patrol vessel, the number 23 Nito Maru, spotted the American task force and radioed a warning to Japan. The cruiser USS Nashville was ordered to sink it. In heavy seas, it took nearly 45 minutes and hundreds of 6-inch shells to destroy the little ship. The stubborn patrol boat refused to go down easily. American radio intelligence confirmed that the Nito Maru had transmitted its sighting report before it went down. The Japanese now knew that American carriers were in the Western Pacific. The task force had been seen. The element of surprise was gone, and the bombers were still 10 hours and roughly 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than the plan required. Every mile of that extra distance was a mile that the bombers would have to fly on fuel they did not have. Launching now meant that the aircraft almost certainly could not reach the Chinese airfields. It meant that every crew would likely crash land or bail out in the darkness over hostile or unfamiliar territory. But not launching meant turning around and sailing home, giving up the mission entirely, and letting the Japanese know that their picket line had worked. Doolittle and Mitchell made the decision in minutes. Launch now. Launch immediately. Launch in conditions that made the original plan look easy. Admiral Halsey signaled the Hornet. The message has been recorded as "Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and gallant command, good luck and God bless you." The weather was atrocious. Rain, gale-force gusts, swells of 20 to 30 feet, with green water breaking over the Hornet's bow. The carrier pitched and rolled so violently that the flight deck rose and fell like a slow-motion elevator. The wind across the deck, combining the ship's speed with the natural gale, reached close to 50 miles per hour. The bombers were re-spotted for engine start. Doolittle's aircraft, the first in line at the bow, had exactly 467 feet of deck ahead of it. A normal B-25 takeoff on land required well over 1,000 feet. 2 white lines had been painted on the deck, one for the nose wheel, one for the left main gear. If the pilot held those lines precisely, his right wingtip would clear the carrier's island superstructure by approximately 6 feet. At 8:20, Doolittle released his brakes. The launch officer, a Navy lieutenant standing at the bow with a checkered flag, had one job. He watched the pitch of the ship. When the bow was at its lowest point, dipping into a trough, he held the flag down. When the bow began to rise, climbing toward a crest, he whipped the flag overhead. That was the signal. Because if the pilot timed it right, the bow would be rising as the bomber reached the end of the deck, effectively launching the aircraft upward off a ramp of moving steel. Doolittle timed it right. His B-25 thundered down the deck, engines screaming at full power, and lifted off the bow with room to spare. For a moment, Observers on the escorting ships saw the bomber drop below the level of the flight deck, falling toward the grey Pacific. Then the nose came up, the engines caught, and the aircraft clawed into the sky. Sailors on every ship in the task force cheered. Many of them had bet money that the takeoff was impossible. They lost those bets gladly. One by one, the remaining 15 bombers followed. Each pilot watched the flag, held the lines, and prayed. Several came terrifyingly close to stalling. One dropped over the bow and disappeared from sight before reappearing just above the wave crests. Navy deck crews wrestled the heavy bombers into position on the slick, heaving deck using ropes and muscle. One sailor stepped into a spinning propeller and lost his arm. Despite everything, all 16 aircraft were airborne between 8:20 and 19 that morning. Not a single bomber was lost on takeoff. One observer later called it a succession of 16 miracles. The bombers flew toward Japan at wave-top level, skimming the whitecaps to avoid detection by radar. Most flew in small groups before separating to approach their individual targets. They arrived over Japan around noon Tokyo time, roughly 6 hours after launch, and climbed to approximately 1,500 feet for their bombing runs. The Japanese were caught entirely by surprise. The air raid drill had ended. Military aircraft were in the sky over Tokyo, rehearsing for the Emperor's birthday celebration. When the American bombers appeared, many Japanese civilians assumed they were part of the exercises. Children waved at them. The bombers struck their targets across 6 cities. In Tokyo, Doolittle's aircraft hit military installations in the northern part of the city. He flew so low over the rooftops that he later said he had broken up a baseball game in one of the parks. Other bombers struck an oil tank farm, a steel mill, and factories in Yokohama. In Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka, additional targets were hit. Lieutenant Everett Holstrom, piloting the 4th bomber, was jumped by Japanese fighters. When his power turret malfunctioned, and he could not return fire, he jettisoned his bombs in the sea rather than risk losing his aircraft before reaching his target area. Every other crew delivered its ordnance. Gunners aboard Lieutenant Harold Watson's aircraft, nicknamed the Whirling Dervish, and Captain Ross Greening's aircraft, called the Hari Courier, claimed hits on 3 Japanese fighters between them. One bomb from Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's bomber struck the nearly completed Japanese light carrier Ryuho at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, delaying her commissioning by several months. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was inspecting military facilities in the Tokyo area at the time of the raid. One B-25 flew so close to his position that the crew could have engaged him, but their orders were strict. Military targets only, no indiscriminate bombing, no hospitals, no schools, no attack on the Imperial Palace. Doolittle had drilled this into every crew during training. He told them that crews were repeatedly briefed to avoid any action that could give the Japanese grounds to say they had bombed or strafed indiscriminately. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was scattered and ineffective. Fighters scrambled too late to intercept. Not a single B-25 was shot down over Japan. The mock broomstick tailguns apparently worked, because no aircraft was attacked from directly behind. In total, the 16 bombers destroyed roughly 112 buildings and killed an estimated 50 to 87 people. In military terms, the damage was negligible. In every other term that mattered, the damage was beyond calculation. After bombing, 15 of the 16 aircraft turned southwest toward China. The 16th, piloted by Captain Edward York, was burning fuel at a catastrophic rate because depot workers in Sacramento had, without authorization, replaced the aircraft's carburetors with a different type that consumed fuel far faster than the originals. York did not have enough fuel to reach China. He diverted north and landed at a Soviet airfield near Vladivostok. Because the Soviet Union was bound by a neutrality pact with Japan and was not at war in the Pacific, York and his 4 crewmen were interned. They would spend roughly 13 months in Soviet custody before being quietly allowed to escape across the border into Iran, an exit that declassified Soviet records later revealed was secretly arranged by the Soviet intelligence services. The other 15 crews were not so fortunate. The early launch had added roughly 170 nautical miles to the flight. The Chinese airfields were not ready because the notification had never arrived. Darkness fell. Fuel gauges dropped. Weather over the Chinese coast turned to rain and fog. One by one, the bombers ran dry. 11 crews bailed out into the darkness. 4 crash-landed along the coast or in the surf. 3 men died that night. Corporal Leland D. Factor, 20 years old, was killed during his bailout over China. Staff Sergeant William J. Dieter and Sergeant Donald E. Fitzmaurice drowned when their bomber ditched in the sea off the Chinese coast. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's bomber, nicknamed the Ruptured Duck, crashed into the surf off a small island near the Chinese coast. All 5 crewmen survived the impact, but Lawson's left leg was crushed. The crew was rescued by Chinese villagers and carried to a mission hospital, where Dr. Thomas Robert White, the raid's only physician, who had gotten himself aboard by qualifying as a gunner on another aircraft, amputated Lawson's gangrenous leg and donated his own blood to keep Lawson alive. Lawson survived. He later wrote a book about the experience called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which became a bestseller and was made into a motion picture starring Spencer Tracy as Doolittle. Doolittle himself bailed out over China and landed in a rice paddy in the darkness near the city of Kuzhou. He was found by Chinese soldiers and civilians who sheltered him and guided him to safety. Among those who assisted the downed airman was a young American missionary named John Birch, who spoke fluent Chinese and served as an interpreter and guide for several of the rescued crews. Birch would later be killed by Chinese communists in 1945, and his name would become the namesake of the John Birch Society in the United States, though the political organization had nothing to do with his wartime service. In 1942, he was simply a young man who helped stranded airmen find their way home. Across the Chinese countryside, 64 of the 80 raiders were rescued by Chinese farmers, soldiers, and missionaries who risked everything to protect them. Villagers hid the Americans in their homes. They carried the wounded on their backs through miles of rough terrain. They shared food from their own tables with strangers who could not speak their language. Many of them knew that if the Japanese discovered what they had done, the punishment would be death. They helped anyway. Those Chinese civilians would pay a price beyond imagination. 8 American airmen were not rescued. They were captured by the Japanese. From Crew 6, Lieutenant Dean E. Hallmark, Lieutenant Robert J. Meader, and Lieutenant Chase Nielsen. From Crew 16, Lieutenant William G. Farrow, Lieutenant Robert L. Height, Lieutenant George Barr, Corporal Jacob DeShazer, and Corporal Harold Spatz, the 20-year-old from Lebo, Kansas. The 8 men were tortured. They were starved. They were forced to sign false confessions stating they had deliberately bombed schools and strafed civilians. On October 14, 1942, a Japanese military tribunal sentenced all 8 to death. The sentence was later commuted for 5 of them to life imprisonment, though they were not told this for months. On October 15, 1942, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, and Harold Spatz were taken to Public Cemetery No. 1 outside Shanghai. They were bound to wooden crosses, and they were executed by firing squad. The night before his execution, William Farrow was permitted to write a letter to his mother. He told her to be brave and strong for his sake. He told her he loved her from the depths of a full heart. And he wrote, "Do not let this get you down." The Japanese never delivered the letter. It was recovered after the war from Japanese files. Robert Meader, one of the 5 whose sentences had been commuted, died in captivity on December 1, 1943, of malnutrition and beriberi. The 4 remaining prisoners, Nielsen, Height, Barr, and DeShazer, endured roughly 40 months of largely solitary confinement on starvation diets in a military prison in Nanking. They were liberated in August of 1945. DeShazer weighed less than 100 pounds when he was freed. He later returned to Japan as a Christian missionary and spent the rest of his life in the country that had imprisoned him. But the cruelest consequence of the raid fell on people who had never heard of Jimmy Doolittle and had no part in the war between America and Japan. It fell on the Chinese civilians who had helped the raiders survive. Furious that China's coastal provinces had served as the Americans' escape route, the Imperial Japanese Army launched the Zhejiang-Jiangxi offensive in May of 1942. 40 infantry battalions and more than 15 artillery battalions swept through the provinces. Their mission was to destroy any airfield that might be used for future raids, and to punish every Chinese community suspected of aiding the American airmen. What followed was systematic slaughter. Japanese troops burned villages, executed civilians, and destroyed crops and water supplies. Units of the infamous biological warfare program known as Unit 731 contaminated wells and food stores with cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and plague. Wartime reports estimated that up to 250,000 Chinese civilians died in the reprisals, a figure cited by historian James M. Scott in his Pulitzer finalist account of the raid, Target Tokyo. Provincial records from Zhejiang document at least 66,526 civilians killed, wounded, or missing in 1942 alone. In the city of Kuzhou, the same city where Doolittle had landed in a rice paddy and been sheltered by local people, over 20,000 civilians were murdered. The Doolittle Raid lasted 30 seconds over each target. The reprisal lasted months. This is the cost that history sometimes forgets to mention. 80 American airmen flew a mission that changed the direction of the Pacific War. The Chinese people who saved them paid a price that dwarfs anything the raiders themselves endured. That price deserves to be spoken aloud, and it deserves to be remembered in the same breath as the bravery of the men who flew. And yet the strategic impact of the raid was undeniable, not because of the bombs that fell on Tokyo, but because of what those bombs did inside the mind of one man, Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto had planned Pearl Harbor. He understood America's industrial capacity better than almost any officer in the Japanese Navy, having studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew that Japan could not win a long war. His strategy depended on a series of rapid, decisive victories that would force America to negotiate a peace before its factories could produce enough ships and planes to overwhelm Japan. Pearl Harbor was supposed to begin that process. The Doolittle Raid stopped it. Because when those 16 bombers appeared over Tokyo, they proved something that Yamamoto and every officer in the Imperial Navy had assured the Emperor would never happen. The home islands were vulnerable. The Emperor himself could have been at risk. The sky above the imperial capital, the most sacred airspace in Japan, had been penetrated by enemy aircraft, and every one of those aircraft had escaped untouched. Yamamoto was reportedly devastated. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command, he became physically ill upon hearing the news. In public, Yamamoto dismissed the attack as the do-nothing raid. In private, the humiliation consumed him. He had personally guaranteed the Emperor's safety. He had assured the government that the home islands could not be touched. And now 16 American bombers had flown over the imperial capital in broad daylight, and the vaunted Japanese air defenses had not shot down a single one. For a military culture built on honor and personal responsibility, the failure was almost unbearable. The raid also shook the Japanese public's confidence in ways that the military leadership had not anticipated. For 5 months, the government had told its citizens that Japan was winning the war and that the enemy could never reach them. The bombs that fell on Tokyo on April 18 shattered that assurance. If the Americans could bomb Tokyo once, they could bomb it again, and the next time there might be more than 16 planes. The sense of vulnerability that settled over the Japanese home islands after the Doolittle Raid never fully lifted. It colored every strategic decision Japan made for the rest of the war. Before the raid, Yamamoto had been pressing for an operation to lure the American carrier fleet into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll. The Japanese Naval General Staff had resisted, arguing that the operation was too risky and the resources were needed elsewhere. After the Doolittle Raid, the resistance collapsed. If American carriers could launch bombers at Tokyo, then those carriers had to be found and destroyed immediately. The home islands and the Emperor could not be left exposed again. Yamamoto got his Midway operation. It was the worst decision of his career. On June 4, 1942, less than 7 weeks after the Doolittle Raid, the Japanese combined fleet sailed toward Midway, with 4 fleet carriers and the most experienced naval air crews in the Pacific. The American Navy, forewarned by intelligence codebreakers, was waiting. In a single day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. It lost 1 heavy cruiser. It lost 248 carrier aircraft. It lost roughly 3,000 men, including hundreds of irreplaceable veteran aviators and mechanics. The United States lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, 1 destroyer, and 144 aircraft. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. After Midway, Japan never again mounted a major offensive. The tide had turned. The raid also forced Japan to keep fighter groups at home for defense of the homeland, aircraft that were desperately needed in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. Every fighter held back to protect Tokyo was a fighter not available at Guadalcanal or New Guinea. The psychological wound kept bleeding long after the bombs had fallen. And there is one more detail about the Doolittle Raid that carries a weight of its own: the USS Hornet, the carrier that had made the impossible possible, the ship whose deck launched those 16 bombers into history, did not survive the year. On October 26, 1942, during the Battle of Santa Cruz in the South Pacific, Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked the Hornet and set her ablaze. She was abandoned and sunk. She earned 4 battle stars before she went down. Her crew had known since April what their ship had done, and they carried that knowledge with them for the 6 months she had left. And the chain of events that led to Midway began with 16 bombers that were never supposed to fly off a ship. This is the part of the story that goes deeper than heroism, deeper than sacrifice, deeper than the technical ingenuity of fitting a medium bomber onto a carrier deck. This is the part about what the Doolittle Raid revealed, not about America's military hardware, but about the kind of people who built it. Every officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy knew, as a matter of professional certainty, that launching a B-25 from a carrier was impossible. They knew it because the mathematics said so. The bomber was too heavy, the deck was too short, the aircraft could not return. No rational military planner would destroy 16 bombers and risk 2 aircraft carriers and 10,000 sailors for a mission that would cause negligible physical damage. The cost-benefit calculation was so obviously negative that the Japanese never considered it as a realistic threat. What they failed to understand was that the Americans had changed the calculation, not by finding a way to make the bombers return, not by extending the range of carrier aircraft, not by developing some secret technology. They changed it by accepting a cost that no other military on Earth would have accepted. They accepted that every aircraft would be lost. They accepted that the damage would be symbolic, not strategic. And they accepted those costs because they understood something about war that the Japanese High Command, for all its tactical brilliance, had missed. They understood that sometimes the impossible only looks impossible because everyone has agreed not to pay the price. The B-25 could always fly off a carrier deck. The engineering was possible from the beginning. Lieutenant Fitzgerald had proven it in February off the Virginia Capes, lifting a bomber into the sky with 500 feet of deck and a headwind. What was missing was not capability. It was willingness. Willingness to throw away 16 aircraft. Willingness to send 80 men on a mission from which they could not return the way they came. Willingness to accept certain material loss for an uncertain psychological gain. The Japanese military operated on a different calculus. In the Imperial Navy, every operation was measured against its strategic return. Resources were carefully husbanded, ships were preserved, aircraft were expected to complete their missions and return to fight again. The concept of deliberately sacrificing 16 bombers for a psychological effect was so alien to Japanese strategic thinking that it never appeared in any threat assessment, any war game, and any planning document. The Japanese had imagined attacks from land bases. They had imagined attacks from carrier-based naval aircraft. They had never imagined an attack from medium bombers that were launched from a carrier with no intention of ever landing again. It was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of imagination, the inability to conceive that an opponent would accept a cost that you yourself would never pay. And that willingness came from a particular kind of person, not the career military officer trained at West Point or Annapolis, though Doolittle had Army experience and one raider, Captain Edward York, was a West Point graduate. The willingness came from men like Ted Lawson, who had worked in an aircraft factory, from Jacob DeShazer, who had worked on a farm, from Harold Spatz, who was barely out of his teenage years when he flew over Tokyo, and only 21 when he was executed by a firing squad in Shanghai, from Dr. Thomas White, who qualified as a gunner just so he could be present to save lives. These were not men bred for war. They were men who chose it, and who carried it out with a combination of ingenuity, recklessness, and moral conviction that the Japanese military establishment never fully understood. Jimmy Doolittle landed in that Chinese rice paddy after bailing out and sat down next to the wreckage of his bomber in the darkness. His ankle was sprained. He was covered in mud. And he was certain, absolutely certain, that the mission had failed. He had lost all 16 aircraft. The damage to Japan was trivial. He had sent 80 men into harm's way and could not account for a single one of them. He believed he would be court-martialed and sent to Fort Leavenworth, or at best assigned to fly a desk for the rest of the war. His gunner, Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard, who had bailed out with him and landed nearby, disagreed. Leonard told Doolittle that when they got home, Doolittle would be promoted to general, given a new airplane, and awarded the Medal of Honor. Doolittle told Leonard he was out of his mind. Leonard was right about everything. Instead of a court-martial, Doolittle received a promotion of 2 full grades, from lieutenant colonel directly to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. The promotion came on April 28, 1942, while Doolittle was still in China. In June, President Roosevelt presented him the Medal of Honor at the White House, with Doolittle's wife Josephine standing beside him as Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall read the citation, honoring his conspicuous leadership above and beyond the call of duty. For an American public battered by months of unbroken bad news, the raid was a lifeline. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Bataan, the fall of Singapore. Since December, every headline had carried defeat. The Doolittle Raid broke that pattern. Headlines blared that Doolittle had done it. Newspapers across the country printed the story on their front pages. Americans who had spent months wondering whether their country could fight back now had their answer. The answer was yes, and it had come from the deck of an aircraft carrier 650 miles out in the Pacific. When reporters pressed Roosevelt for details about where the bombers had come from, the president deflected with a single word. He said they came from Shangri-La, the mythical paradise from James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. The Navy later named an aircraft carrier the USS Shangri-La, christened by Josephine Doolittle. Doolittle went on to hold some of the most important air commands of the war. He led the 12th Air Force in North Africa, where he directed the air campaign supporting the Allied invasion. He commanded the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, striking targets across southern Europe. And he took command of the 8th Air Force over Europe, the mightiest air armada ever assembled, where his aggressive decision to release escort fighters from close bomber formation and allow them to hunt German aircraft on the ground helped win air superiority over Germany in the spring of 1944. That decision, which many bomber commanders opposed because it left the heavy bombers more exposed, was vintage Doolittle. He saw the problem differently than everyone around him. He accepted a cost that others would not, and he was right. He rose to lieutenant general, retired from the Air Force in 1959, and in 1985 was promoted to honorary 4-star general by President Reagan. He died on September 27, 1993, at the age of 96. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His wife Josephine, who had christened the carrier Shangri-La and stood beside him at the Medal of Honor ceremony, preceded him in death by nearly 5 years. Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard, the man who predicted Doolittle's Medal of Honor while sitting in a Chinese rice paddy, was later killed in action in North Africa. Doolittle called Leonard's death the greatest personal loss of his war. The man who had been right about everything did not live to see how right he had been. The Doolittle Raiders held reunions nearly every year from the late 1940s onward. In 1959, the city of Tucson, Arizona, presented them with 80 sterling silver goblets, one for each raider, each engraved twice with the owner's name, so that it could be read whether the goblet was upright or inverted. At each reunion, the goblets of the men who had died in the previous year were turned upside down. The tradition continued for decades, as the number of upright goblets grew smaller and the row of inverted ones grew longer. On November 9, 2013, the 4 surviving raiders held what they declared their final toast at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The last surviving raider was Lieutenant Colonel Richard E. Cole, who had been Doolittle's co-pilot on the lead aircraft that morning off the Hornet's deck. Cole was the man sitting in the right seat when Doolittle released the brakes at 8:20 and rode 467 feet of pitching steel into history. Cole was originally from Dayton, Ohio. After the war, he continued to serve, flying in the China-Burma-India Theater and later in other assignments. In his later years, he lived in Comfort, Texas. He attended air shows well into his hundreds, shaking hands with children and grandchildren of veterans, telling his story to anyone who asked. When asked about the mission, he kept it simple. He said you had to go in with a positive attitude. He said he did not worry about it. It was their job, and they knew what to expect. Dick Cole died on April 9, 2019. He was 103 years old. The final goblet ceremony, delayed by the pandemic, was held on the 80th anniversary of the raid, April 18th, 2022, in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Cole's children turned over his goblet for the last time. Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall offered the final toast, and those gathered responded with the words, "To those who have gone." In 2016, the United States Air Force unveiled its new stealth bomber, the B-21. It was given a name chosen from thousands of submissions. They called it the Raider. There is a cemetery in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, at a place called Epinal. It is one of the American military cemeteries that hold the men who did not come home. If you visit, you will find rows of white crosses and stars of David stretching across manicured grass beneath the trees. Most of the names belong to men who were young when they died, and who are known now only to the families that remember them. But some of the names belong to men whose stories changed the world, even if the world has forgotten how. The Doolittle Raid did not win the Pacific War. It did not destroy a single Japanese division or sink a single Japanese warship, apart from the little Nito Maru that tried to do its duty and warn Tokyo. It did not liberate a single occupied island. Measured by the standards of military damage, it was one of the least effective bombing raids of the entire conflict. But measured by its consequences, it was one of the most important military operations of the 20th century. It proved that Japan was vulnerable. It restored American morale at the moment it was needed most. It pushed the Japanese Navy into the disastrous Midway operation that cost them the war, and it demonstrated a truth about warfare that no amount of planning or calculation could predict. That sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not a bomb or a bullet, it is the willingness of ordinary people to do what everyone else has decided cannot be done. But on April 18, 1942, 80 of those young men, ordinary Americans from 35 states, climbed into 16 bombers that were never designed to fly off a ship and did something that every expert in the world had declared was impossible. They did it not because someone had solved the engineering problem. The engineering had always been possible. They did it because someone, a submarine officer looking out a window in Norfolk, a racing pilot with a doctorate, a farm boy from Oregon, a 20-year-old from Kansas, was willing to look at the word impossible and ask a different question. Not whether it could be done, but what it would cost, and whether the cost was worth paying. The answer, on the morning of April 18, 1942, was yes. 16 times, yes, launched one by one off a pitching flight deck into a gale, each one a bet against every rule of aviation and every assumption of naval warfare, and every single one of them flew. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not yet subscribed, now is the time. And the bell ensures you do not miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, someone whose name you carry or whose stories you grew up hearing, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men and women carried a story like the ones you just heard. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.